A very good morning to you all. Welcome once again to Madrid Platform. This is room 4, pro-business room. This belongs to an international business hub aiming at bridging gaps. We are going to talk about France today. I'm not going to take too much time from you. You can use our official hashtag for the event so that you can share all the content that we are generating today. Hashtag Madrid Platform, so that you can share that content on your social networks. And you can also use the interpreting service, both in English and Spanish, because you know that we are getting many visits from many countries in this room, Madrid Platform, and bridging Latin America and Europe. We are going to talk about France with a roundtable with Berthelemy. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. This is sometimes complicated. He is the director at the French Chamber of Commerce in Madrid. He's going to moderate our roundtable today. We also have Sebastián Álvarez. This is a lot easier for me to pronounce. He's responsible for service for companies at the French Chamber of Commerce in Madrid. And we also have Florian Vincent, consultant at the French Chamber of Commerce in Madrid. We also have Stephanie Hay, co-founder and partner at LVS2. She'll be joining us shortly. So I'll give you the floor. You've got the room for you. And as soon as we have Stephanie on board, she'll be contributing to our talk as well. Thank you very much. I thank Madrid Platform for giving us the chance to participate in this roundtable, knowing that we've got three countries organizing roundtables on their respective markets. I also want to thank the Town Hall for welcoming us in these wonderful facilities that they have. And I want to remind you all of what the Franco Spanish Chamber does. This is a private institution with a presence of more than 125 years in Madrid. We've got 115 chambers in 95 countries. And we've got several activities, consultancy, services, and we are active in the markets where we are present. Our chamber has 150 corporations on board, both from France and Spain. And we try to promote exchanges among these companies. We organize around 100 activities every year. I'm talking about roundtables, events, committees, sectoral groups that we've started up in our chamber. We've got different committees, for example, for digitalization, sustainable transformation, assurances, energy and climate, mobility and logistics, and last but not least, in May, lifestyle, among others. Through these committees, we try to give visibility to good practices from corporations. And we also try to create a flow of business. So this roundtable today is going to allow us to give visibility to good practices and also consultancy for French companies in Spain or for Spanish companies in France. We think France is a very good choice, first of all, because we've got very solid relations between Spain and France. France is our first commercial partner in Spain. We've got 2,500 partner societies in Spain with a turnover of about 90 billion euros. So this is very remarkable. Why France? It's a very near market, proximity market. We are going through a health crisis as well, and we've realized that many companies are focusing on markets that are located near us. Proximity is important. We might find disadvantages in further markets, so proximity markets can be a good refuge for us at this time. The French market, which is a neighbor market, has lots of potential. It's a very attractive market for us, even though it's quite a mature market. So we need to take up precautions as well. France and Spain are neighboring countries with similar mindsets, and sometimes we might make mistakes because of that. So when we are working with France, it is very important to take into account the intercultural dimension. For example, France is a very centralized country, much more than Spain. So a French company in Spain might have trouble understanding how our country works sometimes, and the other way around. That's why we thought that it was very good for us to make the French market more familiar to us. So I suggest that we go through 3 stages in this roundtable. First of all, trying to see the state of affairs on the French market as compared to the Spanish one, especially taking into account the health crisis. Then we should mention sectors with high potential, and then practical aspects. For example, how are we going to work on the French market in practical terms? So I'm going to ask you different questions. We'll break it down on 3 blocks of 10 minutes so that we can share also our views with people following us remotely. So first of all, the situation, the state of affairs that we have. So I'll give the floor to Sébastien, then Florian, consultant for the Department for Studies, and Stephanie A., who just joined us. She is partner and co-founder of LVS2, which is a company specialized in digital marketing and providing services to associate companies and the chamber. So when we want to give visibility to the practices of our partners, we want to have our experts, such as Stephanie, sharing with us her views and her know-how. Thank you very much. So first of all, the state of affairs right now in France, as opposed to the Spanish framework. So Florian, could you talk to us about the comparison between Spain and France? Then Sébastien will talk about relations between Spain and France, and Stephanie will be talking about digital economy. Well, the truth is that France and Spain went through similar paths in the crisis, a historic decrease of its GDP, a slower path as compared to similar countries with similar growth. In the case of Spain, we had an 11% decrease of GDP, 7% more or less in the case of France. We can say that this is due to restrictions, but also to the characteristics of each economy. Before the crisis, France and Spain were the most visited countries in the world. If we don't take into account the Icelandic economy, which is quite small, those developed countries with the highest percentage of tourism were France and Spain. 7–8% in the case of France, and over 12% in the case of Spain. So the tourism sectors were very important for those countries and were hardly hit by the crisis, and that affected the whole of the economies of both countries. In the end, the unemployment increase was not so dramatic as expected, but it didn't reflect the extent, the whole extent of this crisis. It is true that Spain already had a high unemployment rate before this crisis, and towards the end of 2020, its unemployment rate doubled the French one. But if we have a look at the evolution, the dynamics, the increase in that rate was not so considerable. That can be explained by measures taken by the governments in both countries with the ERTES, these schemes so that people were not unemployed but were temporarily out of activity, and then also giving easy terms in order to pay fees and social contributions. And support was so wide that even in this huge crisis, in peaceful times, bankruptcies were lower than in other periods. If we have a look at the IMF estimates for 2021, France and Spain will grow by 6%, more or less. That is a more dynamic recovery than the one that will be experienced by other developed countries. Even though that is positive, there's a compensation effect for these two economies that were hit by the crisis, but this is also due to the recovery schemes funded with European funds to a very great extent. The European institutions controls those schemes, and there's a big focus on digitalization and ecological transition, the energy transition. It is true that there are many economists that talk about growth in GDP of more than 6% for both countries, but it is true that we have to take into account the evolution of the pandemic, the vaccination rate. It all depends on the European Union, and also the solidification of the economy is important. There are many companies that are surviving right now because they are receiving subsidies, so we'll also have to see what happens when they have no more subsidies. And last but not least, we don't know how consumers will be behaving in the future with their savings. Are they going to continue saving, or are they going to spend their money? It all depends on how the recovery will evolve. But one thing is true, we will have a recovery. Yes. Along the same lines Florian mentioned, I would also say that we are here in order to explain how relations between France and Spain are. It is a very good relationship historically. We've got a very similar destiny for both countries. This crisis demonstrates it. We went through a similar path in this crisis, and this crisis strengthened our relations. For example, France was one of the few countries not shutting down borders with Spain during the crisis, and this relation has been strengthened throughout this period. For example, the French president worked very hardly at the European Council so that demands coming from the southern European countries regarding recovery funds was taken on board. France worked together with Germany. We know that these two countries are very important in the European Union, and France defended the Spanish position that funds shouldn't be loans but rather funds that didn't need to be given back. So this strengthened our historically important relation. Spain is the fourth partner for France in economic terms, and France is the first partner for Spain in economic terms. So the relation was very strong already, and now I think that these links between the two countries are going to be strengthened, and we are some sort of a thermometer of how Spanish-French relations are evolving, and we are aware that there are many companies coming from each country wanting to locate themselves in the other country. Brexit is a factor as well. If there hadn't been a Brexit scene, this relation might not have been so strong. So Brexit was an opportunity in that case. And also the health crisis was another factor, because it is more difficult to go to other further located markets outside Europe. So we see that companies having trouble when going internationally, they pay attention to Spain as a very interesting destiny, and the other way around in the case of France. We see that many Spanish companies are contacting us before going to the French market, and the SMEs tissue in Spain is still affected by the 2010 crisis, and they are going to go to France now as an option. That's good news. And even though the crisis has been, the COVID crisis has been very serious, there are some positive aspects to it. Some processes have become more solid. And in the case of Spain, the internationalization of SMEs was one of those processes that needed to be more solid. So I think the crisis accelerated that evolution. Regarding Spanish and French cooperation, we've also seen very positive developments right now. For example, in March, in Montauban, in southern France, the Spanish and French governments gathered and adopted measures so as to strengthen the relation between both countries. And one of the strong decisions back then was to give the possibility to citizens of France and Spanish to apply for double nationality. I think Stephanie is one of those citizens that will have a double nationality, French and Spanish. And that's one of the results coming out of that summit. And I think that attests to the very good moment that we are having in relations between France and Spain. And I think there's a very big opportunity for business for France. Spain is a very important gate for other markets, and the same applies to France when we think about Switzerland and other countries, so that Spain can be more present in Europe, even more present. I totally agree with you, Sebastian. We've also noticed that there's a very strong interest coming from Spain and France when trying to work in the digital sector. France is the third country regarding online sales in Europe. But during the lockdown or during the COVID crisis in 2020, the electronic commerce has soared up totally in France. For example, in 2020, we had 112 billion euros increase in those sales, a very big increase with respect to the previous year. Online sales in retail went from 9.5% to 13.5%. That's a very big increase. Also, the digitalization of small shops was a factor, but e-commerce in France does not just refer to Amazon or other big actors. It was also an important gap for small physical shops to go online. There was a niche for them. In 2020, every half an hour, a new online shop was started up. That's very important. Regarding transaction, we saw a 6% increase, 1.008 billion transactions in 2020. The Christmas period was also very important, and sales registered a very big increase. Going to the nitty-gritty so that we can see the profile of sellers, buyers, around 81% of French citizens bought online, and 91% of people between 35 and 49 years old bought online, and they belong to medium and high classes, 94% more or less. 74% of people over 65 years of age also went online for their sales, for buying. And people who already bought online have strengthened their behavior there. They've kept up buying online. Others that were not so familiar with online shopping tried out online shopping for health reasons. And that would be more or less the state of affairs on the market. Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephanie. I think the information you gave is very interesting. We are also noticing how consumption habits in Spain have changed a lot, and e-commerce is more and more important here, and that's a very important factor for companies wanting to come to Spain or to go to France. And there's a need to adapt to these new trends. So we see that there's fertile ground, there's a potential for business, as we will know in the next months. I would ask you, which would be the most attractive sectors in France? And Stephanie, could you give us some ideas for companies coming from Spain that are still not in France? How could they operate on the e-commerce sector? Well, first of all, in general terms, France is quite an attractive market, offering many opportunities. France is the second economy of the European Union regarding nominal GDP. It's a stable economy, and it's the second most populated country in the European Union, having around 67 million inhabitants, more or less 20 million inhabitants more than the ones in Spain. And it's one of the main recipients of direct investment, foreign direct investment in the world. If I had to mention specific sectors, I would say the green sector. France is the third producer in terms of renewable energies. A very important part of their national recovery scheme is devoted to renewable energies, and France is the seventh most attractive country in the world for investment in renewable energies, thanks to its legislation, policies, and sources. We've got coastline, southern part of Spain is quite of France is very attractive. We see there's innovation in the French economy. France improved a lot in the last few years, approached Germany regarding investment for startups. The United Kingdom is still the model in this sector, startups. But I think France has done a good job. It is true that the French GDP is lower than the German GDP. Paris is the second most attractive city for this sort of investment, right behind the United Kingdom, but ahead of Barcelona, fifth position, and Madrid, sixth position. It is true that Madrid improved very considerably with a very good dynamic. More traditional sectors, such as agri-food, is important in France. France is one of the first countries in the production of bovine meat. We actually invest in fertilizers and also in corporations that want to export agricultural machinery to France. Taking into account our 67 million inhabitants and our 80 million tourists in France, there are lots of opportunities. There's also a very big chance for bioproducts. The automobile industry is very important as well. It's the fifth world producer. France is the fifth world producer in this sector, and we also have been helping companies that want to profit from the automobile sector. Also, taking into account our population, we've got an aged population with a very long life prospect. And that means that we need to cater for this population with their new needs, with new products and services. And then the air sector, the airplane sector, is very important. For many years, it was the main export sector in France. So the turnover in France was 73 billion euros as compared to 30 billion euros in Spain. That is not a complete list of factors, but of sectors, but I would outline those. Yes, regarding the digital sector, I think the environmental sector is very important. Eco-friendly products are very welcome in France. The French population is quite aware of the need to take care of the environment, and I think it's a very interesting line of activity for e-commerce. Also, handicraft is important. We've also seen there was a big demand for cultural products. There has always been a high demand for cultural products, but also for technological products, for teleworking, for distance learning, for children, students. We know that this year there will be changes in the way we consume. We buy or consume many fashion products, but we're talking about a different sort of fashion, for example, sportwear or clothing for staying at home. We are going through a transition period, but once we are back to normality, we'll go to the products we used to buy previously, gourmet products, delicatessen, luxury products, etc. We should also remark that in B2B, according to the ranking of digital transformation in Europe, France is at the third post. B2B commerce provides more than 15% of profitability, so B2B is something we should work on. Travel and transport, computer products, and others should also be taken on board.
I do completely agree with what you just said. We do accompany many French companies on their way to Spain, and in reverse, Spanish companies that go to France. And it works, because when we approach the international project, we do have always certain strengths. If you go for price, maybe things are a little more complicated, because you may win a price battle, but you are going to lose more probably the war, because there is quite lack of continuity, many that enter and then leave again. I think many companies have realized that you need to go for service quality, innovation, and for added value of the product itself, because the French market is attractive, as Florian and Stephanie pointed out. It is a very interesting market because of its size, but also because of the purchase power of the people in France that is rather high, and thus has a potential for consumption and savings. The savings in France during the crisis have been quite considerable. Let's see what's going to happen with that money that has accumulated after the crisis. Hopefully, it will be spent. So, large market with purchasing power, but the demand is geared to products of high quality and that are somewhat different. For instance, in the chamber, we set up a temporary shop in Paris. That's something we do from time to time to promote the Spanish trademark in France. That's necessary because countries like Italy have been doing this for centuries. So Spain is lagging behind in these matters. So promoting is a good vehicle. You know what has been most popular in Paris? That is mineral water from the Teide that is bottled and is sold as bottled clouds or sky. So it's more popular even than olive oil or wine, and quite pricey, by the way, Then there is a tree, an olive tree in Castellón that is aged more than 2,000 years. And that kind of oil really is very sellable. So you need to provide a story, a narrative. What do I offer as an extra, as an added value? What sets us apart? So that is what I would recommend. Many SMEs that get into contact with us do work with the product, but oftentimes neglect a bit the marketing side of things. And if you want to conquer the French market, that's something you can't do. Think about gourmet products, olive oil and ham. France is the major consumer market for extra virgin oil, but you can't just step in and get things rolling. You really need to prepare properly. And then something that Florian already mentioned, I'd like to flesh it out. The bio products, absolutely en vogue, over 20% of yearly growth rate, and the COVID crisis has reinforced this line of activity. But bioproducts aren't something easy. The consumer of bioproducts also looks for local sourcing. That's part of the psychology, part of the mindset. Buying bioproducts from across the world is rather complicated. It should be, in any case, products that can't be found in France or that provide an added value. So you really have to think that through properly, but it's a promising sector. It's economic activity that's very important, bioproduce in Spain, so it holds promise. Furthermore, something we do concentrate a lot, and where there's value in France, is the sourcing of industrial suppliers. And that goes in the direction of what you already mentioned, proximity of markets, things that are closer to us. So we are contacted oftentimes by people who say, I'm looking for a supplier of this wooden product or ceramics or a given mechanical product. Also, in some cases, wrapping, for example. Formerly, you sourced in China. Now, people are looking for suppliers that are in the proximity, that are closer at hand. And this is where Spain comes in. So there is quite a lot of potential there. But if you ask me for a recommendation, and I suppose we're going to talk about this presently, so it's information, marketing, presentation, and as Stephanie said, and I suppose she's going to flesh this out, you need the digital part, digital tools. You need to have a proper presentation, the web page, digital campaigns, and that's a must if you want to have an entry point into the French market. Thank you. So there is a market, there is potential we're interested in, and it's important for companies that arrive in France and also companies who want to access the French market through these two countries, France and Spain. So there is potential, there are opportunities, but we've talked about various branches of industry and sector, but and sometimes people don't prepare well enough and thus don't have a success. But even in niche markets, preparation is of the essence. Storytelling, mission preparedness are key. France and Spain are very close at hand, and you might say, I just take the step and arrive there and got it made. But that's not the case. Even if you have the product, maybe you lack the success because you don't know how to adapt and how to operate in a given market. So, before the debate, we have our last panel that would deal with practical advice for a Spanish company, for example, who wants to go to France. What do you have to do? And then online and offline strategies. Maybe Stephanie will deal with this last digital side of things. Florian. Well, we in the chamber do realize that there is interest on the part of business to access the French market. But as Sebastián well said, it is a quite mature market, not easily accessed. You need to invest. It's not just a matter of acquiring a list of contacts for 500 euros and then you got it made. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. You need to have the proper budget and preparation. And before going international through export or setting up a branch, if possible, you need to do market research or mapping of your competitors, because many companies say, oh, I don't have a lot of competitors in France. And then when we try to reconnoiter in France, the echo is that there are a lot of similar companies present in the French market already. So it's a mature market, so there's a price competition, which is difficult to maintain in the long run, or you have an added value through quality, through innovation, and so on. And before you start your project, you need to take stock of your production capacities. Maybe you are an SME, you do have already everyone working to capacity with 95% capacity already taken up with your new machinery. If you don't have the capability to acquire additional resources, then it's no use to take the leap to France. We've seen that sometimes when French in France they ask, can you serve X volume of products in this timeline? The SMEs sometimes cannot respond to this demand for lack of potential. And then communication support. That's another key element. Many companies say, our webpage is in French, but then I access the page and see that half of it is in French, the rest is not, and the French part is even poorly translated. And that doesn't necessarily generate trust and confidence on the part of the potential partner. But once somebody accesses a poorly translated and presented website that doesn't deliver this image of a serious, competent company. Furthermore, if you have a meeting with prospective French clients, you need to be available, which I know is difficult for reasons of agenda, because everybody is very busy, but you need to be able to adapt to the agenda of the French partners. I have had to postpone several times meetings that had been scheduled, and that is either interpreted as a lack of seriousness, of commitment, and is very detrimental. So you have to be humble if you want to go international. You don't criticize the country of destination, in this case France, for example, because this is counterproductive. Then you need to understand that you need to adapt to the market. It doesn't work the other way around. I get many complaints that in the French companies they don't speak very well English. Okay, but that's what it is. You need to adapt. And you need to be humble. If my product is successful in Spain, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to be one-to-one successful in France. Probably you need to adjust your communication and trade strategy. Probably my campaign in Spain is not directly adaptable or translatable to France. So these will be the main ideas. Yes, language is important. In Spain, oftentimes we say that we don't speak many foreign languages, but the same applies to France. You need to bear that in mind. I remember Minister of Economy of Germany, he said, if you want to sell me something, you need to speak German to me. Otherwise, we can speak English. So we need to bear that in mind. Now we have the digital field. Stephanie will be dealing with this. I, on my part, would like to talk about the strategy. What do we need to develop in order to be able to sell? So my product is ready, adapted to the market. What do I do? For the SMEs, there are two solutions, the way I see it. Either you have the necessary sales and commercial team that knows the market and can develop it. That would be the internal level. Then we can give support, give listings, help with visibility and contacts. But not many do that. To have specialized French sales expert is rather rare, although it pays off because then you have also can spearhead into other French-speaking markets. But as I said, that is not very often the case. So you can outsource your sales staff. The distributor, for example, who will be dealing with the products and developing the market. Obviously, in theory, that's the best possible solution, but in reality, it is not that easy. If our product is not well known in the destination market, it's going to be difficult because people don't want to include it in their catalog. So we need to get the destination to know your product beforehand. And oftentimes, you are lacking the national capacity. Oftentimes, people say, oh, I got to know a distributor in a trade fair, but we're not selling a lot. No, the distributor works for his or her own purposes, and the effort correlates with the margin that person or company is getting. And here comes in a figure that is the commercial agent. Very effective. That's a person that really works for the company with marketing, with in situ work on the market of destination. If you want to sell to hotels, for example, to catering, you need to go knock on doors. And the distributor doesn't do that always, but the agent will. The commercial agent goes by commission, by fees, doesn't have a fixed salary. We might explain the possibilities and avenues, but we'll leave that for another session. But the commercial agent is losing a bit of impetus in France In some sectors like industry, it's still okay, but in agro-food or textile industries, this is flagging a bit. There is less interest for this professional profile. Young people are not so interested because obviously that's a person that needs to be there, very present, always active. It takes a lot of dedication. So we first need to know what kind of profile of figure we want to develop. We need to be on the lookout for this contact, and this is where we as a chamber come in and help. That's one of our missions, but first we need to look into the various sectors to know what is most fitting. And sometimes you can combine both. That would be an excellent strategy. And we do recommend the online strategy more and more to underpin the offline approach. And this is where Stephanie is going to contribute. Well, I'm glad to hear what you're saying, because this is what we argue with our clients oftentimes when they want to go to the French market. First, you need a strategy. It's a must. If you want to go to France, innovation and so forth, as you already mentioned. In France, there is a trend. In all products that are produced in France, you would have a French banner that says designed or produced in France. So what does that mean? If there is an equal or similar product, the French citizen is going to go French, go for the French product. So you definitely need to pinpoint the storytelling, this thing that sets you apart, that sets your product apart and makes it more attractive. Obviously, you have to study competitors. That's part of the strategy. And secondly, you need a proper budget. The main mistake is, I have an online store. Yes, I have somebody in my team that has been to France sometime, and let that person translate my material. That's wrong. You do need either a native speaker or a professional translator. Florian already said, we get people that contact us, they want to go to France, they have French in their websites, but poorly written. The accents are wrong, and it doesn't generate the necessary trust for the consumer. So it's a question of common sense. If you want to buy a product in Spain and you have a poorly translated website in Spanish, so what's going to be your reaction? What do you think? Is this a serious, solid, robust business? Yes or no? We rather go elsewhere. So we need to properly translate the text. We need to adapt it. Remember, in France, you don't go by Christian names. It's more formal. You need to adapt accordingly. Internet opens markets and helps, but you do need the necessary budget to underpin your strategy, to shore it up. So, what do I do with my budget? I adapt, I translate my website, and also concentrate on usability. Price is a factor, as already mentioned, but if this website is well presented and competes one-to-one with some company in France, then price is an important element. And then we need to generate trust. If someone is visiting my web page, we need to convey this image of seriousness with trust modules, for example, timelines for deliveries or quality label. We need to communicate it. If we have an award, let's showcase it and include it there. We need to include trust pilots, for example, and the labels can vary from one country to another. And form of payment, TPV, PayPal, Bizum, that is known in Spain. It doesn't exist in France. And then you may have payment against reimbursement or through a check, for example, and then delivery either through mail, but there is also Mondial Relais in France, where you have a point, a proximity point where you can collect the parcel. So I do have my page, I have properly adapted it, my product fact sheets are okay, but then I need my positioning strategy. So you need to think about this, and then Google Ads and Google Shopping, search and queries, and social media, very important. I'm not going to communicate as I'm doing here. So messages do differ quite considerably. So in a nutshell, if you start to work in another market, French market in this case, try to put yourself in the other's shoes and try to think how you would react if a French company would try to sell you something. No English. People are pretty lazy in internet. If it is in English, unless it is a very added value product, then you're not going to be successful. You need to adapt. Well, thank you. I think adaptation is key. I think we're on time. I do think we need to close, but in closing, let me thank you all. It has been very informative, also because you have given us a lot of very concrete examples, especially for the SMEs. Yes, thank you. Again, as a takeaway, we have the biomarket, the specificities of the biomarket, and what proximity means for the Spanish market vis-à-vis France. So thank you so much, and we'll be back in about an hour with more countries that are going to be showcased here in this meeting room of Madrid platform today.